Steve went to Hazeldale Elementary School. I went to Lakeshore. But we both went to the same church, Messiah Lutheran, just south of where Columbia River High School is now. But in those days, Columbia River High School didn't exist. On Sunday mornings, during part of the first teenage years of our lives, we went to Messiah Lutheran for catechism class. That's where I met a lot of the kids from my extended neighborhood that I would eventually go to junior and senior high school with. Steve was amongst those. As I look back on the catechism class graduation picture, I see the faces of Randy, Glenda, Steve, John, Carol, and so many others. This was a time of life when friendships were being formed that would last for a lifetime. Groups of kids were bunching together and hanging out and getting to know each other better and enjoying each other's company more and more. John and Steve and I were one of those small groups that grew into a larger group over time. After school, Steve went into the Coast Guard. When he got back from the Coast Guard, he was ready for a little of the alternative lifestyle of the early 70s, like so many of us were. He, Tom, and George rented a house on the north side of Hazeldale, just south of Salmon Creek. Steve called that house the Chateau in the Pines. There weren't any pines there, but there were a lot of big trees, and the name fit the place. It was an old two-story house with a basement and a large detached garage. It was on a couple of acres of land, and we had a little nirvana there. It was above the cut as Highway 99 dropped down to cross Salmon Creek. It was pretty secluded, which suited us and our partying activities very well. We had lots of good times in that house. As I remember, those that lived there were Steve, Tom, me, Alan, Danny, Marcia, George, and maybe one or two others that came and went. The house address was 11209 Northeast Highway 99. Somewhere along the line, Steve came up with a turkey chick. He built a large cage that had no bottom so it could be moved around the backyard, and Rodriguez, as Steve named him, could pick at the bugs in different parts of the yard. Rodriguez grew into a giant turkey of about 30 pounds, was dispatched, cooked, and ate. One time, when we lived at the chateau, George, Tom, Steve, and I did a road trip over to the southern Washington coast in George's company station wagon. We drove and drove. We laughed and laughed. We went out to a lighthouse. The wind was blowing so hard that the sand was being lifted from the beach and getting into our eyes. We got back in the car away from all that wind and blowing sand. As we drove around the Ilwaco Long Beach areas, at various times Steve would ask George to turn left or turn right at the next corner. Steve was looking for seclusion, and he thought it might be just around the next corner. We turned a lot of corners that afternoon, and Steve checked out all the prospects. This was an ongoing theme of humor that day, and it led to lots of laughter. Whatever Steve saw or didn't see, we ended up back at the chateau and were happy to be there. After all, the chateau was pretty secluded. We were a motley crew of hipsters, and we drank a lot of beer. We saved the cases and bottles in the garage, and when there was enough saved, we'd recycle them and take the money we got and buy a keg and have a party. There were always plenty of volunteers to come over and help us drink the beer, play some badminton, and hang out. So a lot of cheap beer and a lot of good times were had at the Chateau in the Pines. Badminton tournaments number 2 and 3, maybe 4, were at the Chateau. Then they moved to Middle Class Manor down by Leverage Park. The Chateau was eventually torn down and an apartment complex went in, but not before Steve and Tom removed the newel post as a memento. That newel post became the badminton tournament trophy. Time moved on, the Chateau was raised, and we all scattered into different pursuits of life. Danny went to Seattle, Alan went to Portland and became a lawyer, Tom went to work for the Postal Service, George ran a gas station, I went back and finished school and became an appraiser, Marcia went to teaching school, Steve was still looking for seclusion. As the years went by and badminton tournaments came and went, the newel post from the Chateau got more and more names added to it. We all continued our various careers and adventures in life. Steve moved into a 28-foot sailboat that he bought and lived at Tomahawk Island. We all had a lot of fun going over and visiting Steve and going out for sailboat rides on the river. Sometimes we spent vacations together on the river. Sometimes we went upriver, sometimes we went downriver. And as usual, a lot of cheap beer played into our adventures. In those days, the Lucky Lager Brewery made a product called beer. It was in a white painted steel can with the word beer on the side. These were steel cans that were sealed and needed a triangular-shaped opener to pierce the top and open the can so you could get the beer out of the can and put it in your stomach where it belonged. One summer vacation, we loaded about 20 cases of beer into Steve's boat. I had my Hobie Cat, and we headed upriver towards Beacon Rock. We spent a week out on the river. There were 5 of us: Steve, me, Marilyn, Grant, and another fellow whose name I don't remember. Steve, Grant, and the other fellow worked at the post office together. In the middle 1970s, there was very little private river traffic out on that part of the river. While we were out there, we didn't see anyone else camping in those islands. There were lots of people at Rooster Rock playing naked hacky sack and splashing in the mud, but nowhere else. We camped on the islands at night, and there was no one around. We built a fire every night, but one afternoon we came into a beach and decided we'd spend the afternoon there. We built a fire. Then we spent the rest of the afternoon working in teams and bringing the biggest wood we could carry and stacking it on the fire. After some time, there was no small wood in the fire. It was all large logs, so the sandy beach center of the fire was red hot and pretty open. I don't remember who tossed that can into the fire. Maybe someone stumbled and dropped it. The miracle was that the can toppled into the fire and landed upside down. Those cans were a 1-unit steel bottom and sides with the top crimped on, like so many cans that we buy at the grocery store and open with a can opener and still use today. We all looked at that can. We wondered what would happen. We watched as the paint burned away from the outside of the can. Then the concave bottom popped out to a convex shape. Now we were backing up a little. We didn't know if it would explode or produce shrapnel. Then there was a loud pop, and that can shot 30 to 40 feet up into the air. There was an audible whoa from the crowd. Suddenly there were several cans in the fire and people with sticks maneuvering them into a position for the next launch. By nightfall, we all, except Marilyn, had our clothes off and were dancing wildly around the fire. What Marilyn did was take out her camera and shoot oodles of photos. Snap, wind, snap, wind, snap, wind. She was busy with that camera. She would have had a fine collection of evidence for our zaniness. At one point, Grant put marshmallows in his eye sockets and was dancing naked around the fire. But the film had never advanced in Marilyn's camera. No photos were captured on film. Probably better that way. We had fun. As the years went by, Tom worked at the P.O., John at the aluminum mill, then opened a grocery store on 72nd Avenue. I worked as an appraiser, and Steve headed off, continuing his search for seclusion. Alan worked for the PLF in Oregon. Danny was still in Seattle. Marcia continued teaching. Life went on as badminton tournament after badminton tournament continued to come and go. Steve had a series of boats. There was the 28-foot Lancer, then the cement boat he kept in John's side yard and built into something of a floating log cabin, then moved to Multnomah Channel. I think there were other accommodations that he had until his most recent boat that he lived on until his final day. He always lived on boats and always continued to seek seclusion. He lived in various places: Tomahawk Island, Leeward Isle, Sauvie Island, and most recently, Elakaman Marina in Cathlamet, where there was shore power to run the heater on his boat. Some years he would cast off from whatever dock he was staying at and go out and anchor on the river and spend the better weather of summer in seclusion, which Steve seemed to enjoy. When I was in the Peace Corps down in Guatemala, much to my surprise and delight, I got a letter from Steve expressing that he had no idea what it was like where I was, but he looked forward to my return. I also got a letter from Tom with similar sentiments, but I haven't forgotten the closing of Tom's letter. He wrote, "Toot toot and don't eat the earwigs." Only from a fertile imagination comes such sage advice, which of course I have followed. In recent years, a number of friends would stop by and visit Steve at Cathlamet. People going to the coast would stop by. I like to ride motorcycles, so I decided that Steve's place was a good destination, so I rode out there for a visit every now and then. One cool day, I showed up on my motorcycle wearing my cold weather gear, which is all black and gray, and I was wearing a white helmet with black trim. When I got down to Steve's boat, he and a friend were getting smoked up and totally freaked when they saw this motorcycle dude come walking up to the boat. They thought I was the police. The last time I saw Steve was last summer in Cathlamet. I had taken my boat down for a few days on the river and had a visit with Steve. As was his habit, he had some complaints to share. Someone in the marina was bugging him. Someone in the town was bugging him. The VA was bugging him. The tax man was bugging him. Katie was bugging him. Steve was very clever with his hands. One time I came home to the chateau and Steve had a length of cedar that he was carving on. At one end was a cedar plank. At the other end, emerging, was a wooden chain that he had carved from that cedar plank. I thought that Steve was amazingly clever. And there were the Bork bears. Steve would carve bears from juniper logs. Sometimes he would sell them by the roadside. Sometime he'd sell them at John's grocery store. I bought one from Steve when he lived on Tom and Ray's property in Washougal, and I bought one that was for sale at John's store. Down at Cathlamet, he got a new motor for the back of his boat, but he had no motor mount. So instead of buying a motor mount at a store, Steve gathered the materials that he would need to make one, collected the necessary hardware, and fabricated his own. It's a good one, too. When I went down to take photos of Steve's boat on March 31st, it looked like Steve still lived there and was likely out on the dock someplace. Steve was a bit bristly on the exterior, but a kind and decent human being inside. His dad and my dad were best friends. I always enjoyed Bud Bork, Steve's dad, and my life has been better for knowing Steve and being friends. Although I was not looking for seclusion, I always enjoyed visiting seclusion and finding Steve at home there. Adios, muchacho. I'll be thinking of you.